welcome you back to week number 8, chapter 8 of our series, His Story. We've been walking through the major storyline of the life of Jesus, and I hope you've been following along with us. Hope you've been reading along in your copy of His Story book, and just a few pages each week allows you to make this come to life and make it real for you, where you're studying it for yourself and covering the full material, not just the things that we're able to highlight in the sermon time. And so I hope you're following along, reading along, joining in a group with us. We're about halfway through it. We've actually covered most of Jesus' ministry. We're in the third year of His ministry, and we're just a couple of chapters away from being into the final week of Jesus' life. And we'll slow the clock down a little bit and spend a little more time there as we wrap up this series. You know, I can tell a lot about people and how much they know me, if they really know me or if they know about me by what they call me. You know, I get phone calls all the time, and sometimes they'll make it to my office and I'll pick up the phone and somebody will inquire something like this: Reverend Pittman? And I know immediately it's somebody I don't know, because nobody that knows me uses that term with me. Sometimes it's Pastor Pittman or Pastor. And for the most part, we don't use titles like that around our church. Some of you are comfortable doing that because of the way that you grew up, but I'm not used to people calling me pastor. And so most of the time, those are people that maybe know me a little bit, but are not close friends. I have people then that are my friends that are going to call me Greg. People that are good friends, acquaintances, people that have been coming to church, they know just to greet me by that name. Now, there's another whole group of people that I went to school with or maybe played ball with back in another era, and they call me Pittman. And just by that term, I can almost identify that handful of people that would call me by my last name like that. Of course, then there's other names that people are going to call me, some of them even more closer to home, like Dad. And immediately I know that isn't even a more select group of people that are going to call me. And then there's only one person that calls me names like Honey. That's my wife. I know just by what people call me, whether they know me and even to some degree how much they know me, or whether they just know about me. And we've talked all along in this series about how it's easy for us to confuse knowing about Jesus with the really more important thing, and that is knowing Jesus. We've talked about how it's possible for you to be informed about Jesus but not be transformed by Him. That it's possible that you could grow up in church, as much as it scares me, that you could grow up in church and you could know lots about Jesus, but that you wouldn't have a personal relationship with Him. And we're going to see, especially in chapter 8, that the identity of Jesus is going to be such a critical thing of who Jesus really is and what Jesus you really see in your relationship with Him. And so we've been talking about Jesus' life. Most recently, Jesus has been up in the far northern part of Palestine. He's been in an area called Galilee. But it's there that from there that He's going to go down to Jerusalem. In fact, we wound up at the end of chapter 7 with Jesus' own brother saying, Jesus, if you want to make it big, if you're going to really make a splash, if you're going to get people to follow you, you need to go down to the Festival of Shelters, or the Festival of Dedication, sometimes it's called. You need to go down to that, and you need to get to the big city, and people are really going to follow you. At this point in time, Jesus' brothers didn't follow Jesus. They didn't believe Jesus. They were almost antagonistic with that, and that's going to be one of the things that we'll see later on. The resurrection of Jesus is going to convince at least James and Judas, that Jesus' brother, that they ought to follow Him, and they're going to become leaders in the church. And so that's going to take place. But at this point, that has not happened, and so they don't convince Jesus to go down with Him. But Jesus is going to show up later. In fact, Jesus has been intentionally avoiding the highlights and the crowds. He's been trying to stay behind the scenes. But he's going to show up about halfway through this festival of shelters, this festival of booths sometimes that it's called. In fact, it's one of the three major festivals that any good Jewish man and family would go to, where they would actually make pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and the men would go to the temple. We know, of course, the Passover feast, the festival there, the Pentecost, where they celebrated the laws of God being given. The Passover, obviously, the festival that commemorates the Passover lamb and the death angel passing over. And then there is this festival of shelters, or festival of booths that it's sometimes called. And what it commemorates is the time that the Israelites were in the wilderness after they had escaped Egyptian slavery. It's a celebration of escaping Egyptian slavery. And so part of it is just kind of a fall festival, a festival of the harvest. But in addition to it, this exodus from Egyptian slavery. And there's some very specific symbols that are involved in this particular festival. One of them is the people would actually live and eat in these little booths or little tents that they would make. And so in Jerusalem, they were lining the streets and all over the place, people living inside these little temporary shelters. And that symbol was to remind them that they wandered in the wilderness, that they set up tents, that they were nomads, that they were pilgrims. And so that was a big symbol. There was another symbol of the candelabra that would be lit and light up the court of women at the temple. And so it was a huge demonstration. It was a huge visual display. It cast out a lot of light. And then along with that, there would be this parade of torches where people would walk along a specific route, and it was a reminder of God leading them as a pillar of fire at night. Remember when the Israelites were wandering around in the wilderness, leaving Egypt, and God led them during the day by this pillar of smoke, by night by this pillar of fire. They could look outside their tent. When that fire was there, they knew God's presence was there. And so this was a reminder to them. That's going to be important because we're going to talk about during this time or immediately after, Jesus is going to say, I am the light of the world, and it's going to have tremendous significance to that symbol right there. There's also another symbol that was important, and that was that water was brought up from this spring, from this, what they called the pool of Siloam. It was the pool of, Siloam meant sent. And there would be this parade where a priest every day would go and get water from this pool. And again, it was an important symbol because it was a reminder of God providing water from the rock. Remember when they were wandering around in the wilderness and they were thirsty, and God provides that water for them? And Jesus is going to incorporate that symbol in others. In fact, he'll use that when he'll actually send the blind man to that pool to go wash. And so again, it's going to have all kinds of imagery as Jesus is teaching and doing miracles around this particular time. And again, the question that we're going to keep coming to through this particular chapter is, who really is Jesus? What is his identity? Really, who is he? In fact, you remember last chapter 7 of his story, we talked about from Matthew 16, Jesus, when they were on the very north side of the Sea of Galilee near Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asking his disciples in this very pagan idol god worship area, who do people say that I am? People said, you're a prophet, you're Elijah, you're John the Baptist, come back, and they had all kinds of ideas. And Jesus said, who do you say that I am? And it became a critical time when it was Peter that said, we believe that you are the Christ, the anointed one, the Son of God, the living God, not one of these dead pagan statues, but the living God. And those disciples from that point on, that became kind of a marking point for them of believing Jesus as the one sent by God. And so this is going to be another marking time where Jesus is going to call people to believe in who he really is, who the real Jesus is. And as you read through chapter 8, you're going to find, if you haven't read it already, if you have, you're going to find many different ideas about who Jesus is. In fact, as I was going along, I just wrote in the margin the question, who, with the question mark. Of different times people thought about Jesus. In fact, there at one point, it's mentioned that he was a good man. In one point, it is by some of the Pharisees, he is considered a fraud. He is deceiving the people, they said. At one point, the blind man calls him a prophet. At another point, in a conversation with some of the Pharisees, Jesus is kind of between the lines called illegitimate. They said, at least we're not illegitimate, and you kind of read between the lines like you are. Again, questioning, his paternity, questioning who his father is in that particular situation, which would have been the case in these very conservative, strict Jewish people. Some people said he's just an ordinary sinner. He's like all the rest of us. He's just an ordinary sinner. At one point, they said he is controlled by Satan. He's possessed by Satan. He's out of his mind. But there were some people, it says, that they believed that he was the Messiah, that he was the anointed one sent by God. And so laced throughout this chapter, you keep finding this misunderstanding, all kinds of ideas about who Jesus is. And that's still the case for people today. All kinds of ideas about who people think Jesus really is. Well, lots of people that think he's a very good person. That he was a model of morality for us, that he was somebody to look up to, that he was a good example. There are people that think that he was a good teacher, that he was a prophet, maybe from some god or from some higher power figure. They maybe don't know that, but they recognize that he at least taught some good things, that he was able to influence. He was a good leader, maybe. All kinds of people think that he is an absolute a fraud, that he was some crazy person, that he had no idea what he was talking about. They don't believe him at all. They think he was just lying, that the resurrection is a whole hoax. All kinds of people that go down that. And then there's people like you and I that believe that there's something to his claims. And in fact, we see what he claims to be. In fact, in this particular chapter, we're going to see from the Gospel of John 4 different I am statements. I am something. And there's 8 or 9 of those, depending on what you count in the Gospel of John. And we've already read one of them. We read when Jesus said, I am the bread of life, immediately after he fed the 5,000. And again, it was at that point where people began to turn away from him, because he said, I want you to eat my flesh and I want you to drink my blood. And the crowds began to leave behind. Jesus has already said, I'm the bread of life. If you'll eat of me, if you'll drink of me, you'll never go thirsty. And so Jesus is going to give us some more I am statements. And in fact, in this one, you read this statement right here when he said, I am the light of the world. Immediately after this festival of shelters, this festival of booths, that's one of the things that he's going to say. And again, it's in the context of people and that great menorah being lit up. And it's in the context of people being recalled through this parade of lights of God leading their ancestors through the wilderness by this pillar of fire. And the idea, this imagery of light exposing darkness, that there is this battle between light and darkness. And so people understood when Jesus said, I am the light of the world, in this context, they recognized that he was saying that I'm equal to God. That God and I are one. In fact, he'll make that statement just a little bit later on. They're going to understand that at least that he is an envoy of God, because they recognize God is light. The Bible says that throughout, that God is light, exposes darkness, brings truth to light. And of course, we understand Jesus now saying, I'm the light of the world. And he has already said his people, his children, are the light of the world. And we're going to continue to see that through the New Testament, this idea of light. And the response when people heard Jesus saying, I am the light of the world, that you need to follow me, that I am the one, their response was that, hey, we don't believe you. You're just witnessing to yourself. You're just saying something about yourself. Well, when the truth is, when we were in John chapter 5, and there was a man who had been born lame, and Jesus healed him, and Jesus gave lots of testimony. He said, God testifies about me, and John the Baptist testifies about me. The scriptures testify, all the prophets are pointing to me. Moses himself even talked about me. The miracles that I do, all of those things testify to myself. And so Jesus isn't going to go into that again. He's content just to say, I am the light of the world. I am. Now, he's going to make another I am statement that goes this way. Before Abraham was born, I am. He's going to get into a conversation with these Pharisees, with these Jewish leaders, that is going to revolve around the person of Abraham. And when they get to that context right there, and Jesus is talking to them about Abraham, they said, we're children of Abraham. You know, that was kind of their national leader. He was the George Washington of the Jewish people. And Jesus is going to say, listen, Abraham, I knew Abraham long before he was around. Before Abraham, I am. Before Abraham was even born, Jesus is saying, I am. And as soon as he makes that statement, in fact, all of these I am statements are going to lead to this, but especially that one. Before Abraham was born, I am. And as soon as they heard those words, it's pointing back to when Moses is before that burning bush, and God is calling through that burning bush to go back to Egypt and to go back and to help deliver his people out of Egyptian slavery. And Moses is saying, well, God, they're going to ask me, who sent me? Who's sending me? Who gives me the authority? If you remember Exodus 3:14, God says to Moses, you tell them, I am has sent you. The great I am has sent you. It's the same word right here of Jesus saying, before Abraham was born, I am, the ever-existing one. And again, Jesus is saying, I am the Son of God. I am God in the flesh. And it was so inflammatory to them, the text tells us that they picked up stones. They are ready to murder the guy because of his blasphemy, equating himself to God right here, right on the spot. Well, Jesus is also going to make some other claims in this chapter. One of them is, here again, I am the gate for the sheep. In fact, it's a common illustration throughout the Bible, this idea of sheep and shepherds. The 23rd Psalm talks about God as the good shepherd. Often God's people are equated to sheep, and we tend to think of sheep as kind of these fluffy, cute little animals, but in reality, they're kind of dirty, dumb animals, and so it's probably not for us a compliment. And we tend to think of shepherds as, kind of good guys. I mean, after all, it was the shepherds who went to see Jesus when he was born in the manger. And so we kind of have maybe a little tainted view of shepherds and sheep from reading through the Bible and hearing Sunday school lessons and having that kind of stuff. But in reality, the sheep are dumb animals, and shepherds were not highly respected people. They were the poor people working the minimum wage job, and sometimes they were even people that were crooked and stole from other people. In this particular case, Jesus is going to say, I am the gate for the sheep. Because what happened is shepherds, they went out with the sheep and they lived with them for a time. There was no coming back into town. You were with the sheep. You were responsible for this flock of sheep. And at night, you would come into some kind of enclosure. If there was some money involved, if the owner of the sheep had some money, it might be a fenced-in area. And if not, maybe it was just a thicket that had been formed where sheep could not get out of it. And when Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep, he's not saying I'm like a gate on your fence that opens in and out, because what a shepherd would do is they would actually lay at the opening to this enclosure, and if you wanted in, you had to come over the shepherd. Or if a sheep wanted out, they had to get through the shepherd or over the shepherd. And what Jesus is saying is, I am that gate. I am that way of being able to get in or out. I am the gate for the sheep, and I am protecting the sheep at night. I am keeping those that want to come in and cause them harm. In fact, in that particular part of the text, Jesus talks about both thieves and robbers. And what thieves would do, they're the ones that would try to sneak in. They might try to crawl in over the enclosure, sneak in through the gate. or there were robbers, the ones that would actually come in and cause the problem, actually rob, maybe even do harm to the shepherd. And Jesus is saying, I'm the one that will provide the safety. I will not allow those things to come in through that opening. And Jesus also says then that it is through that gate, through me, that you are saved. In fact, it'll be later on that Jesus will say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Again, the idea of we are saved through Jesus, that we come to God through Jesus, the gateway for the sheep. In fact, Jesus is going to give one of his purpose statements. He does this 3 times throughout the Gospels. And in fact, each one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark are going to share one, but Luke, John is going to record this one. We're going to talk about those purpose statements next week. But in this case, he talks about, it's in the context of Jesus saying, I am the gate for the sheep. He says the thief's purpose is to steal, kill, and destroy. Now, he's talking about Satan, but it's in the context of a thief coming in to threaten the sheep, to steal sheep, to get them for their own. But Jesus says, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life, to give them abundant life, to give them life to the fullest, depending on the version that you typically read. And so that's what Jesus is saying. My purpose is to give that kind of saving, abundant, rich, satisfying life. I am the gate, and this is my purpose. Jesus is going to make one other purpose or one other claim in this chapter 8 of his story. And immediately after saying, I am the gate for the sheep, he's going to say, I am the good shepherd. Again, that immediately tells his audience that he is claiming to be deity, that he is claiming to be God. They all knew the 23rd Psalm. They all knew King David writing about the good shepherd. And now Jesus is saying, oh, by the way, I am the good shepherd. And you can tell the good shepherd because he sacrifices his life for his flock. He doesn't run away scared when they get threatened. That's what a shepherd would do. They were minimum wage people. They're not going to sacrifice their life, but the good shepherd, the one that really cares about the sheep, will sacrifice his life for whatever endangers them. I am the good shepherd. I know and I care for my sheep, as opposed to the hireling it talks about in there, the person that just is in it for the money. And Jesus, at this point, is beginning to point people towards the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the Jewish leadership, as the hirelings, the people that are mistreating the Jewish people, the Jewish sheep. And then Jesus is going to say, my sheep listen to my voice. And that's the way a shepherd would work in that day. They lived with the sheep. The sheep knew their voice. They could call out, they could whistle, and sheep that had been mixed together, the ones that were to follow that shepherd, would immediately follow, would immediately come to that particular shepherd and follow them. And again, there's going to be a response when Jesus makes such claims, and the response is, this man is demon-possessed. He is out of his mind. He's crazy. That's in essence what they were saying. This man is crazy. And every time Jesus made a claim, there was a response like that. In fact, as you were reading through chapter 8, you probably read time and time again this particular statement right here. His time had not yet come. They were ready to put their hands on him, and then the text would say his time had not yet come. They were angry at what he said, and they were getting ready to stone him, but his time had not yet come. And sometimes Jesus, it seems like, would just slip out of their grasp. Sometimes it seemed as if Jesus was hiding or would move to a situation that would get away from him. But obviously, we're getting close now to when Jesus' time is going to come. There is going to be a time where he is going to allow the Jewish leaders to take hold of him and to crucify him. But at this point, it is not time to do that. They kept trying to get Jesus because of these outrageous claims that he's making, but they can't. Which probably brings us to our point again about who Jesus is. When you begin to read these encounters, and again, I hope we haven't had time to talk about all the conversations and the discussions, but when you begin to read about the true Jesus, he is not a sissy. He is not just some kind, polite, good citizen, always has children in his arms. He's not the Jesus that I remember seeing in pictures on my Sunday school wall of almost kind of a meek and thin and had a pale face and was kind of portrayed almost as this nerdy looking person that you hoped maybe he hadn't eaten enough. We just have this picture that Jesus is this kind of person, that he's always playing with kids, he's always telling people just to be nice to one another, that he's somehow this nice, easily approachable, unintimidating person. But as I'm reading through chapter 8 and I'm reading the true story of Jesus, I'm not seeing that kind of person sticking out to me. The person that becomes obvious here is a person who is very confident in what he's doing. And he has something in mind. There is a person, he is on mission for God, and he's not afraid to confront people, and he's not afraid to people to do the things that nobody else will do. He loves the untouchable, and he irritates the people that everybody else thinks are important. He makes bold, bodacious claims. He stands up to the religious establishment. He courageously even deals on a regular basis at this point with death threats. And he told people to follow him, and if they didn't follow him or if they refused to, he said, "Get out of my way." And what I'm wondering is it possible that we have some distorted view of who Jesus is? Maybe for some of you, it's possible that you've not even read the story. You've just relied upon what somebody else has told you about. You've got bits and pieces. Maybe you've got some movie clips that you think of. Maybe you've got some pictures from some old Sunday school classroom somewhere. Maybe some flannel graph. Maybe some video, and that's your picture of who Jesus is. And what I'm wondering is it possible that we've got this distorted view of who Jesus is? And the question for us is, are we following Jesus for who he really is? Are we following the real Jesus? In fact, in this chapter, we see a picture of someone who did. Right in the middle of this entire chapter is the story of Jesus healing a blind man in John chapter 9. And it seems that Jesus is walking with his disciples in the midst of all these conversations about who he is. And the disciples see a blind man. He's probably there at one of the entrances to the temple, one of the gates there. And the disciples just casually ask him, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin, or was it because of the sin of his parents? We don't have time to get into all the beliefs of that day and age and why they might think that. But the question is, why was he born this way? And Jesus is very clear. He's saying it wasn't either. It wasn't his sin, wasn't the sin of his parents. He was born so that God might be glorified. And in fact, Jesus is going to spit into the dirt. He's going to make some mud. He's going to wipe this saliva mud over the man's eyes, and he's going to tell him to go to the pool of Siloam. He's going to tell him to go to that pool that everybody would have known. Everybody would have known the trek. They'd watched it happen in the last festival. And this man is going to go and he's going to wash this mud out of his eyes, and he is instantly going to be able to see. A man that was never in his life has he been able to see. And at that point in time, he's going to be able to see. And he's going to go directly home. Where else would you go if suddenly you could see now? We know this man is at least of age. He is adult. Maybe he's 25, maybe he's 30. So he's an adult man, but he goes home, and we began to see neighbors start coming to him and going, wait a minute, is this our neighbor? He was blind. It can't be him. And the man's saying, it's me. Of course it's me. I'm telling you it's me. And the people take him to the Pharisees and say, this was a man that was born blind. He's been blind all his life. We've known him forever. And that Jesus healed him. In fact, they're going to tell him Jesus healed him because it's on the Sabbath. We've already talked about why that was bad for Jesus in the minds of the Pharisees to be able to do that at that particular time. And so they're going to bring the man before them. Who is it that healed you? What authority does he have to do that? And the man's going to say, I have no idea. Maybe he's a prophet. Well, they're not content with that. They call the man's parents in. What do you know about the story? What do you know about the situation? They're like, we don't know. He's a grown man. Let him speak for himself. Now, John writes a highlight for us and says they didn't want to say anything because they were afraid that they were going to get excommunicated. They were going to get thrown out of the synagogue. And so they don't say anything. The Pharisees call the man back in again and say, hey, come on, give us something. What do you know about this man? I love what he says in John chapter 9, verse 25. That I don't know whether he's a sinner or not. That's what they kept saying. We know he's a sinner. We know he's a sinner. He goes, I don't know whether he's a sinner or not, but I know this. I was blind, and now I can see. Kind of love that, don't you? In the face of these righteous people, he in the face of them, he says, listen, I don't know. All I can speak is what I have experienced. I used to be blind, and now I can see. That's a great way just to share about your faith and about what Jesus has done for you. You don't have to know lots of stuff about the Bible to be able to just say, listen, I used to be this way, and this is what Jesus has done for me. This is what my experience with Jesus has done for me. And here's what I think happens when we follow the true Jesus, the real Jesus. When you follow Jesus for who he is, not our messed up, distorted, blinded views, but when we follow Jesus for who he is, you can't help but tell others about him. When you're following that Jesus, when you're following the Jesus we've been talking about in his story, when you know more than just stories about him and you know who he is, who he really is, then you can't help but to tell other people about him. This man went immediately home and began to talk with people about him. This man is called before the Jewish leaders, and he says, let me just tell you, this is who I know him to be. This is what he did for me. And let me just suggest for you that maybe if you have trouble telling other people about Jesus, whatever you call it, sharing your faith, evangelizing people, talking about God, talking about spiritual things, just maybe if you have problems doing that, if you're reluctant to do that, if that's hard for you to do that, maybe it's more about who you believe Jesus to be. Maybe it's not your personality, maybe it's not maybe it's simply who you believe Jesus to be. Is it a real Jesus? Is it the true Jesus that you have come to follow? Now, I like the story, it goes on just a little bit because the man is still talking to those Pharisees. And he says, if this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. In fact, I believe this man is from God. Otherwise, how could he have done this? And it so incenses the Pharisees. Listen, you were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? It just shows how arrogant they were. And they threw him out of the synagogue. That didn't just mean like bouncers bumped him out and said, yeah, you're out of here. It meant he was excommunicated. He was removed from the synagogue and he would not be allowed to come back in. Exactly what his parents were concerned about, because when you did that, you lost your community. You lost your connection. You lost your ability to worship religiously. You lost a lot of that. This would have been a huge thing for a family like this. And yet this man, because he is bold in the face of these arrogant spiritual leaders, is going to get kicked out. It teaches us something else here, that when you follow Jesus, the real Jesus, when you follow Jesus for who he is, you can't help but hold loosely the things of this world. You don't get attached to the material things. You don't get attached to the consumeristic mentality that our culture has. You're able to hold loosely to those things because you've got something that's so much more important. And by the way, this man, he never had anything to begin with. This man had been born blind. He had been blind all his life. For him now to be removed from the synagogue, it didn't make any difference. This man can see now. He's got something that was significant that Jesus had done for him. And so again, let me ask this question this way. If you struggle with the stuff in your life, the possessions in your life, holding on tightly to physical things, it may not just be that you're that way or you're wired that way or it's the culture that we live in, although all of those things contribute. It may be the view of Jesus that you have. It may be the the person that you are following, it may be that you've got some different kind of distorted view than what he really, really is. Now, what's interesting in the story is that the man gets booted out of the synagogue, and Jesus is going to go look for him. Jesus finds the man, and they have this conversation. Found the man and asked him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The man answered, "Who is he, sir? I want to believe in him." "Well, you've seen him," Jesus said, "and he's speaking to you." "Yes, Lord, I believe," the man said. And he worshiped Jesus. That word worship right there, it means that he bent and kissed toward. That was the literal meaning of the word. This man right here on the spot, not in a church building, not in a synagogue, right there in just ordinary daily life, this man worshiped Jesus. I love that idea of worshiping Jesus no matter what. He didn't need something to worship Jesus except a picture of the true Jesus. And when you think about it, this man went from understanding Jesus to, he goes, I think he must be a prophet, or he must be from God. He wasn't really sure. They call him Jesus, to this is a prophet, and here he is calling him Lord. So let me again suggest to you that if worship has become an issue for you, if you're struggling with the concept of worship in some way, maybe it has to do with your picture of Jesus. Not the environment from which it's done, not the circumstances, not the music, not the people, not the players, because worship is all about you and Jesus. And when you have a correct understanding of who Jesus is, every time we read it in the Bible, you cannot help but stop and worship him. In fact, most often you fall down flat on your face and you begin to kiss toward Jesus. What's interesting is immediately after, Jesus is going to tell about some people that wanted to follow him. In fact, there are three potential followers. People that are a little uncertain in this case about who Jesus is. And so Jesus is going to have an interview with these people about them following him. Look what happens in Luke chapter 9. You can help follow Jesus. You can't help but worship him. We've already talked about that. As they were walking along, Luke 9, someone said to Jesus, I'll follow you wherever you go. But Jesus replied, foxes have dens to live in, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place even to lay his head. We're told in Matthew that this was a teacher of the law. This is a potential follower that's saying, Jesus, I'll follow you wherever. And Jesus is very clear to make sure that this man knows that he's homeless, that he has no place to lay his head. Doesn't mean that he doesn't have anything, but that he needs to know if he's going to follow, that he is going to lose out on the comforts of life. We're not told exactly, but it's kind of insinuated here that this man refuses to follow, that this man does not come through and follow Jesus. And so Jesus, in this case, says, you'll miss out on the comforts of life, and the man has to choose, and he chooses for the comforts. That's a pretty serious temptation for many of us that are considering following Jesus or currently following Jesus. The comforts of life get in the way. There are things that we can put in front of Jesus, the house, the stuff that goes in the house, the vehicles that you drive, the things that entertain you. All of those things can be things that keep us, just as this person was kept from following Jesus. Or he said to another person, come follow me. This is somebody that's not yet followed him. The man agreed, but he said, first, Lord, let me return home and bury my father. But Jesus said to him, let the spiritually dead bury their own dead. Your duty is to go and preach about the kingdom of God. Sounds a little harsh for Jesus to say something like that to a potential follower, but you need to understand in this particular culture, when somebody died, they buried him that day. This person's father had probably not died yet, and this person is saying, let me wait for my dad to die, and let me wait to get my inheritance. And what Jesus is saying is that it's possible for you to, put off following him. I'll do that someday. I've got good intentions, Jesus. Well, when this happens, when my dad dies, when I get married, well, when we start having kids, well, when things settle down in life, well, when things get back to normal, well, when we move to the new place, well, you can always have good intentions and you can always put off following Jesus. That was the case with this man. Or there was another potential follower. Lord, I will follow you, but first let me say goodbye to my family. But Jesus told him, anyone who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. So another follower says, I want to follow you, Jesus, but I need to go say goodbye. Sounds like a reasonable request. But again, in this Eastern culture, it was not just a, hey, I'm going to go, I got to go, I love you, bye, hugs, that kind of thing. It was a festival. When someone left home, there were weeks of festivities. There was a celebration. There were party after party after party. And what Jesus is saying is those are things that will distract you from following me. In fact, if you're following me, don't look behind. Don't look at other things. Don't get distracted. You come follow me. You might think that is unbelievable that Jesus would ask that much. Who can follow that kind of person at that level? You might think that would be impossible. But even in the text we find that's not, because it's immediately after this, Jesus is going to ask 72 people to go be his missionaries to the villages around Judea. It sounds a little familiar because we've already read where Jesus sent out his 12, but that was in Galilee. They went to the villages there over a longer period of time. Jesus is now sending 72 to some of the surrounding villages in the area around Jerusalem. And so there are at least 72. In fact, Jesus says he chose 72, assuming out of many others at this point in time. So there are at least 72 people who have given up everything to follow Jesus. They are following him at the level that Jesus expects. It comes down to a choice for us, doesn't it? Am I going to follow Jesus, or am I going to follow the comforts of life? Am I going to follow Jesus, or am I just always going to have good intentions to do that and never get around to it? Am I going to follow Jesus, or am I going to get distracted with the things of this life? You have a choice. In fact, the last story in chapter 8 talks about the choice. It talks about a man who throws a great banquet. He's been planning to do this for some time, and he's told people about it, but the day comes, he throws the banquet, he gets all the food, all the stuffs together, and he tells his servants, you go out and tell everybody it's ready, come in. And one by one, people begin to have excuses. One said to the servant who was making the invitations for his master, oh, I can't do it. I just bought a field and I got to go look at it. Another one said, oh, I just bought a team of oxen and I need to go test drive them. Another one said, please excuse me, I just got married and I can't come. All seem to be normal kinds of excuses, but they all fall shallow. And we're told in the story that the man, says to his servant, you go out and you invite everybody else that you can to come to my great banquet. The truth is, we have all been invited. If you're listening to this, if you're seated here, you've been invited to be a part of the banquet of Jesus that God the Father is throwing. And the choice of whether you attend or not, the choice of whether you follow him or not, the choice of whether you see Jesus for who he is, the real Jesus, is up to you. You've been invited. Will you respond to the invitation? Father, thank you for showing us the real Jesus. Thank you for letting us get a glimpse of that through your word. And God, help us not ever to be content with some abbreviated version of who he is or some distorted view of who he is. But God, would you reveal to us, would you open our eyes to the real Jesus? And God, may we follow him fully. In Jesus' name, amen.